Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Kelsey Engvik from the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. ACS is an international association of healthcare professionals on the forefront of cannabinoid medicine. Founded by physicians in 2018, ACS is uniquely positioned to advocate for the highest standards in the practice of cannabis medicine and safeguard patient care. Today, we will be having a conversation centered around addressing cannabis and the unmet needs of patients in the U.S. I am joined by two special guests, Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, the U.S.'s largest cannabis reform advocacy organization. Paul has over 2 decades of experience working in cannabis policy and has written numerous books, articles, and op-eds on reform policy in the cannabis space. We are lucky to have him join us. We are also joined by Dr. Jordan Tishler, a cannabinoid specialist and Harvard doctor and instructor. He is also founder and president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, or ACS. Dr. Tishler is a national, international keynote speaker and author on a variety of topics related to the medical applications of cannabinoids, has numerous scientific and lay publications, has developed ongoing CME educational programs, and maintains a steady roster of PhD candidates and resident trainees in his clinic in MD. Thank you both for joining us today. Let's jump right into the discussion. So, with policy evolution, how has the landscape of cannabis policy changed in the United States over the past decade? And these questions are for both of you to answer.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll go first. As you said in the introduction, this year is actually my 30th year working professionally in this cannabis policy space. So as you can imagine, I've sort of had a front row seat to really seismic changes that have occurred over the last 3 decades, both politically, scientifically, and also culturally. You know, one of the ways I tend to bookend conversations like this is to remind folks that when I came to Washington, D.C. in 1994, there were few, if any, real policy discussions taking place surrounding cannabis in Washington, D.C. But there was one particular piece of legislation that was introduced that was fairly prominent, that did receive a hearing. And that was a bill that was introduced by one-time Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, that sought to impose the death penalty for the importation of more than 2 ounces of marijuana into the United States. So to give people context and perspective, you know, it was just 30 years ago where the only discussion taking place among federally elected officials was whether or not it was a sound policy decision to execute people who used cannabis. Today, of course, we're living in a very different environment. 38 states regulate medical cannabis access at the state level. 24 states regulate adult use marijuana access. And within the last few days, we have heard strong rumors that there is going to be a change in the classification of cannabis at the federal level that acknowledges what patients around this country have told us for decades, and that is that cannabis has legitimate therapeutic utility. So while there's certainly more work to be done in the future, a lot has changed, and changed for the better, in the last 3 decades.
Must have been very exciting to live through all of those changes, though very frustrating, certainly at the outset. I think I would, having not been in this field for quite 30 years.
Lucky you.
I would say that, you know, what's been interesting to me on a more recent level has been sort of the advent of the recreational market. I sort of often, with a bit of chagrin, point out that when Massachusetts was considering legalizing for recreational use, I campaigned on behalf of that that ballot initiative. I somewhat regret that now. My thought at the time was that that medical use was one thing and that recreational use was another, and that in the medical only scenario, we really had a whole lot of people sort of masquerading, for lack of a better word, as patients who were really recreational users, but this was the way that they could access cannabis legally. And that to me was understandable, but it was driving the perspective and economics of the medical side in a direction that wasn't really all that helpful to patients. And so my thought was, fine, we need to separate this out and let people who want to use this stuff for fun use this stuff for fun, and then have some greater facility for medical patients. And what I've seen subsequently has not panned out that way. What I've seen is that the recreational model has really taken over, and has now gotten to the point where patients are really not getting much of anything through the medical system. And I think that that's problematic. And so, when I think about these things, I think it's great that we're moving in the positive direction, but there are some of these sort of positive elements that come with some negative consequences that have me fairly concerned.
Yeah, the collapsing of the market, I think, is an issue of legitimate concern. And it is one that I think stems from a lack of understanding that these are two distinct markets, that the people patronizing these two markets typically have very different motivations for their use, and the products that they are choosing are typically very different in nature because of that. And the frequency of use is often also going to be very different. And that failure to recognize that these are two distinct markets, I think, is something that in many cases that responsibility falls a bit on regulators and lawmakers who typically just see marijuana as marijuana and cannabis as cannabis and their users as users, and not, again, understanding that there are very distinct motivations, there is a variety of products, and that you cannot necessarily lump all of these folks together. And unfortunately, I do think some regulators and lawmakers have been very short-sighted in doing so.
I couldn't disagree with that. I do think that there is some element also kind of on the industry side, which is to say that they have a fair amount of marketing dollars, which makes sense, and that, quite frankly, it probably is more to their bottom line, at least in the short term, to treat everybody as a recreational patron, if you will, because we doctors do have a tendency to think about things like safety and dosing and sort of trying to keep that on the DL, to increase patient safety as well as efficacy. And so from what I think is a fairly short-sighted perspective, there's a sort of desire to get the doctors kind of out of the field, if you will, and treat everybody, again, in that recreational sense. And, if you have back pain or whatever, come in and our bud tenders will tell you which strains to buy or whatever. And I don't think that serves patients at all. But I also think it doesn't serve the industry very well, in the sense that, as you said, if these are really two distinct groups, then maintaining or amplifying the ability for patients to get what they need, as well as the guidance that they need, in the long term is going to create brand loyalty, to the dispensary, to the product, credibility, et cetera. And one of the areas where I see a huge issue is getting non-cannabis oriented clinicians. So not me, because I'm already in, right? But many of my colleagues who are in primary care or other sort of front-facing areas of this kind of medicine, to understand this as a viable, credible option for their patients. And until the majority of Americans hear it from their regular doctor, the doctor in whom they trust, I don't think most Americans are going to avail themselves sort of outside of that medical rubric. And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing this market collapse.
Children need your help. Older folks need your help too. Whether it's brain-destroying seizures or life-crippling pain, cannabinoid medications can be a game changer. At the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, we are on a mission to train healthcare providers using research-backed science and to advocate for delivery systems that better serve patient care. Our children need us, and our parents do too. Help ACS bring care and relief to all who need it. Donate to ACS today.
So you bring up, I think, two really good points that I'd really like to sort of expand upon and maybe discuss further. First, this notion of the industry and it perhaps being short-sighted. I agree. And I think it goes even beyond what you talked about. When I see this focus on higher potency products that is being pushed by the industry, I think I can't imagine a more short-sighted strategy. Because when you think of the broad base of individuals who are currently using cannabis or potentially could benefit from cannabis, the majority of those folks are not going to be comfortable with or have a positive experience with highly potent products. That's not even necessarily what they're seeking, right? So for the industry, I think to fixate to some degree on making some of these more potent concentrated products, they inadvertently are actually pushing away large majorities of the potential consumer market without necessarily even knowing it, right? So that's an issue that I think is really a place where the industry needs to think longer term, educate itself, and where the consumers as well need to understand that this isn't solely about the most bang for your buck, that in fact there is a variety of products, and that in the majority of cases, these moderate to lower potency products will be just as satisfying, will meet just as many needs as these individuals are seeking. So that's something that I think has been largely missing from a lot of these conversations. The other piece that you brought up, Jordan, that I think is really relevant, and perhaps you can shed more light on, is, we're now, if we go back to California in 1996, we're now almost 30 years into a real world experience in this country with the regulation of medical cannabis, with patients using medical cannabis under the supervision of physicians. Yet I don't have to tell you that poll after poll, survey after survey, whether we're talking about primary care physicians or pharmacists or students in medical school, tell us again and again that a significant swath of health practitioners will say they're uncomfortable having these conversations about cannabis with their patients. And when you ask them why, they tend to say, well, this just wasn't something I was educated about in medical school. While, in my opinion, that might have been a viable response 25 years ago, to me, it just doesn't seem like a credible response today. It would be like if I went to see my primary care physician and I said, I have some questions I need to ask you about the COVID virus. And she said, Paul, I went to medical school in 2008 and there wasn't COVID. So I'm sorry, I can't help you. I just never learned about it. That would be absurd and we wouldn't accept it. So I'm not quite clear why we accept so many physicians simply saying, well, simply because I wasn't taught this 20 years ago is somehow a justification for I'm not comfortable talking about it now. Because patients are using this now, they have questions about it, and I agree, it shouldn't be bud tenders answering their questions. It should be their primary health practitioners.
Right. Look, I think we're on the same page here. There are a few structural elements that I think are impeding physicians kind of getting on this bandwagon. But I agree with your general premise that this is something that they need to know and that it's unacceptable for them to stick their head in the sand about it. Um, you know, when you're out of medical school, you tend to learn about things through these continuing medical education activities. There are many of them on this topic out there. Certainly, we at the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists put together a whole range of them, some of which are focused on doctors like myself who need to learn this to kind of have that depth, but also who are you know, the primary care folks. And I worked for several years with Harvard Medical School to put together a course that was aimed not at specialists like myself, but again, the primary care world. And unfortunately, they ultimately pulled the plug on it because they decided that they didn't have the appetite for it. They said it was too biased. It was too pro cannabis as a medicine. And I said, there's nothing in this course that isn't substantiated by human evidence, not just lab evidence, but human evidence. And at some point, they didn't want to talk about it any further. And I think that's embarrassing to them. But there is an issue there. I think that the other issue is that, you know, you mentioned the legislation that came about that started the ball rolling from 1996 in California. And as you are well aware, in 96, there was a lot of consternation amongst physicians about what the DEA was going to do. And, you know, would people go to jail or lose their DEA registration or all those things that thankfully mostly didn't come to pass. And so that law kind of took an approach which was almost sort of like the baton, you know, the conductor. Yes, you can have it. No, you shouldn't have it. You know, the doctor's job was just to say yes or no. And then the patient would go out and kind of fumble their way through it with the advice of their friends or their cousin or you know, others that grew up in this industry subsequent to that. And I think, you know, in 1996, given the complexity of that state and federal animosity, if you will, I can understand how they wrote that law. But as you say, it's 30 years later. And frankly, I think that that's vastly out of date. And the idea that a physician just simply gives you permission without adhering to the basics of what we call informed consent, which is that, you know, whenever you're going to prescribe a medicine, the job of the doctor is to teach you about the pros and cons of the medicine so that you as an individual patient then can make an informed decision about will you or won't you take that medicine. And we're not living up to that. And I think that that's now malpractice not to adhere to that. But the structures that have swept across the country all look like that 1996 approach, which I think is just vastly out of date. So for a lot of my practice, and I think, you know, my colleagues look at this and say, look, if I can't write a prescription, if I can't be sure that my patient is going to get what it is they need, then how can I stick my foot in this pond, right? How can I, in good faith, take care of my patients and say, this is what you need, go get it. And then the patient gets down to the store and the bud tender says, and this is actually a quote that was reflected back to me by a patient. The bud tender says, oh, I don't understand what your doctor's talking about. Never mind what he said. I'll tell you what to do. You know, with that kind of a background, I think you can start to understand how my colleagues are sort of justifiably, you know, scratching their head at best.
I will say, Paul, you made a good point about the, you know, people saying that they don't have enough education, you know, around the subject of cannabis. And I will mention that ACS has quite a selection of courses for doctors to kind of get in there and understand, you know, a little bit more. We're also working on a CME course for doctors to understand cannabis. So we're working as an organization on the education portion of things.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important. It is something that has motivated me over the better part of these last 30 years, is that if you want to encourage responsible use, then you have to provide consumers, whether they be patients or using for some other reason, with the information that allows them to make informed choices. And I've said this publicly, that when you simply flip a switch and one day a state goes from cannabis being illegal to cannabis suddenly being legal, and with it comes a broad array of products that consumers have access to that perhaps in the past they never had access to and are unfamiliar with, then we have an obligation, all of us, those advocating for these changes, those in the industry, all of us, public health, have an obligation to provide these individuals in these states with the information they need to make those informed choices. And I fear that's a component that's sometimes missing, because either that isn't sexy enough to fund, or because individuals can't reach a consensus as to what the message should be, very similar to the experience you laid out earlier. And as a result, we have these entire swath of consumers sort of left to their own devices to either try to find this information out themselves on the internet, which can lead them down any number of roads, not necessarily accurate ones, or relying on folks that have a conflict of interest, again, like a bud tender at a dispensary whose manager may have said, hey, this is the product I need you to be pushing for the next 7 days. And again, it's discouraging. It's one of the reasons many years ago I wrote the book Clinical Applications for Cannabis, that reviews about 450 peer-reviewed studies looking at the safety and efficacy of cannabis in about 20 plus different patient populations. It's because for years I was getting these phone calls from patients or the family of patients who said, marijuana is now legal in my state as a medicine. My brother just got a recommendation from a physician, but now he doesn't know what to do with it. He went to a dispensary. He didn't know what to buy. The doctor wouldn't give him any guidance on what sort of dosing or what sort of formulation of cannabis to use. And so now I'm calling you. And I said, there needs to be a middleman. There shouldn't have to be, but there needs to be a middleman so that somebody can provide patients with the information they need to educate themselves, and also provide information to physicians so they become more comfortable talking about having these discussions with their patients, and so they realize this is legitimate. And that was the motivation now almost 20 years ago for writing that publication, that unfortunately is still necessary because, again, these disconnects are still going on.
Absolutely. I'd love to switch gears a little bit now and just move on to another question. What are NORML's current priorities in terms of advocacy for medical cannabis? And how do they educate legislators and the public on cannabis issues?
Sure. So again, to sort of repeat what I said earlier, much of our focus at NORML is trying to provide accurate information to consumers so they can make these educated choices. And so to that end, I've spent the better part of the last 30 years really reviewing and summarizing the relevant scientific literature. In our correspondences that go out every week to our membership, I typically highlight 3 to 4 peer-reviewed studies every week, most of those focusing on safety and efficacy of cannabis in different patient populations. So we can provide that evidence-based, again, so that patients can make these responsible choices. And so that they also don't get duped by individuals who may not have their best interests in mind. When look, cannabis is not a cure-all. I don't have to tell you that, but there are certainly folks out there that cynically promote it as if it is. This was really something that was a big deal in the early months of the COVID pandemic, when you had some of these operators trying to push cannabis as an antiviral agent in any number of things to treat COVID, and the evidence simply wasn't there. And we were one of the few organizations in this space that was very public about that and calling those organizations out because our responsibility was to the health of the consumer. And so again, that's really our bottom line. So, the same way we can educate those consumers, we try to educate lawmakers, although that's typically a much more difficult process than educating individuals who are interested in this topic and want to learn about it, as opposed sometimes to lawmakers who literally don't want to learn about this, don't want to know the information that is out there.
Dr. Tishler, what was your experience during COVID? Was it similar to what Paul just mentioned?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that, my phone rang and rang for people who, number one, were responding to CBD protects you against COVID. And, the interesting thing, and this kind of gets to something that Paul touched on, which is, there's not no evidence for that. There is evidence that CBD could in fact protect against COVID, just not in human beings,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
So at the cell culture level, but the problem is what we know is that only about 6% of things that work in animals and cell culture turn out to work in human beings. So we never really got to the next set of steps. Yet people were out there sort of capitalizing on that to sell CBD. And then there were also an interesting influx of people who had been, at least here in Massachusetts, purchasing on the recreational market that got shut down temporarily during the pandemic. And so they were coming to me because they wanted to kind of go back into that old model of getting a medical card. And I sort of had to look at that and say, what do I do with this, given the fact that I know that they're really coming from this recreational point of view? Why do I want to be involved in providing either care in a somewhat resistant fashion or meaning they were somewhat resistant to my input and or it's just a sham? And ultimately, I decided that it was probably better for them if I took a flyer on it and said, all right, now that we're together, what can I do to help influence this person's life for the better, either by helping guide the therapy or helping them watch their dose and their total intake and all of those sorts of things to maintain benefit and to mitigate harms. And I think that, as COVID passed, certainly many of those people drifted away, but not all of them. And so I think that ultimately that just proves that for a physician like myself to take the time, even not just on the medical side, but on that recreational side, where a patient comes into their primary care doctor and the doctor should be asking, are you using cannabis? In what form and how? And, then thinking about if it's being used in a sort of self-medicating fashion, how can we do this better? Or if it's simply a recreational endeavor, how do we make sure that that person is being safe about it and not being led from, a 2.5 milligram gummy on up through, doing dabs, which is sort of a continuum of dose, which can at some point cross the line from being safe and fun to being unhealthy.
Yeah. And also unnecessary, as I don't have to tell you, dose is so inherently linked to effect. And, we can say something, we can look at something like pain medications. We have a range of pain medications that come in all sorts of strengths and potencies. And they are typically tailored toward the individual's need and the dose is tailored that way. And cannabis, I think, should be seen in a very, very similar fashion. One dose certainly doesn't fit all.
And at the same time, with those conventional medications, we also have an idea that there's an upper range, right? At some point, taking more doesn't make it work better. It just
Correct.
Makes the risk higher. And that's true of all medicines, not just the obvious opioids or benzos, but blood pressure medications have risk too. And at some point, you kind of max them out and they're doing the best they can. And giving more just increases the risk of, say, kidney failure or some other negative outcome. And, the same thing I think is applicable in cannabis. But it's also maybe tainted isn't quite the right word because it's pejorative, but there is a cultural element to it also, which is that, I've met many cannabis aficionados over the year who will sort of, as a badge of courage, say, oh, yeah, I'm taking 200 milligrams, or whatever. And there's this kind of macho thing that more is better, rather than saying, oh my God, I've gotten myself up to 200 milligrams at a dose. That can't be good for my brain, which it isn't. And doctor, can you help me get this back into a safer range where, by the way, it's going to work for my whatever the fill in the blank problem is better, or even just be a cheaper date on Saturday night. That kind of popular point of view. And you said this earlier, we need to educate people, consumers broadly, so that we are not saying, more is better and, puts hair on your chest and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting because I initially felt that the trend towards some of these higher potency products would really be a short-term fad, that the novelty of them would wear off. And I still think at the end of the day it will, because I don't think the demand for these products is necessarily organic. I think that there are simply greater profit margins on some of those products, and that's why some consumers are being directed toward them. But again, at the end of the day, I agree with you. This idea that it's all about potency or it's all about THC, I think is a very narrow and largely uninformed view. And again, it's up to us to educate the public so that they are more aware of that and not, again, just gravitating toward this notion that bigger is better. Unfortunately, I think to some degree, we're when we try to do so, we're running up against a narrative that in some ways is almost inherently American. That and it's going to require, again, patience and diligence on our part to sort of retrain the public's mindset, to get away from from that sort of narrow narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it is impressively American that you want a big SUV and not a small little, Yugo or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
and so we're definitely running into that. But then the other part of it is that there's a narrative that cannabis is safer than other substances, which it is, right? I mean, the dependence rate for cannabis is less than half that for alcohol, which is its next nearest safer neighbor. That didn't come out very well, but what I always say is, look, safer doesn't mean safe, and I think particularly when we're looking at this as a justification for using cannabis in a sort of loose and not so thoughtful approach, or when we start to look at those high potency products, that argument that it's safer kind of gets used to say you can do whatever you want. And ultimately, we know that people do become dependent and even in rare instances addicted to cannabis. And somehow we've gone from, this is the devil's lettuce, you can't touch it, it's illegal, and we're going to throw you in jail for your own benefit kind of weirdness, to, anything goes, go ahead and kind of, use whatever at whatever doses. And the reality, which again, Americans don't do very well, is a nuanced approach right down the middle where it's, this can be helpful if you take care of it and you do it properly, or it can get out of hand. And that's a tough sell.
Yeah. I wonder how much you might think that providing individuals with this notion that cannabis promotes homeostasis might help go a long way toward discouraging folks from maybe using cannabis in a manner that is out of balance, because the goal of the ECS is really to sort of strike this balance. And we've even seen some data that shows there can be a downregulation of endogenous cannabinoid production when a person's externally using quite a bit of cannabis. So the body's constantly in this state to try to find this right balance. That to me tells me that there is a desire at sort of the most organic level possible to not get this system out of whack, which to me speaks toward the benefit of moderation.
I'm right there with you. I think, I often either when I'm giving talks or even just talking to my individual patients, sort of try to conjure up this image of what the receptors look like. And I always say they look like the little satellite dishes you see on the side of the houses, right? To give people a visual. And I say, look, you need a whole bunch of them, and their job is not to hear the cannabis. It's to hear our endogenous signaling, the endocannabinoids. And when you flood the system with a lot of THC, it's like we're shouting at our brains. And so what do our brains do? They take those receptors down, right? Well, then the THC isn't shouting so loudly, but it can't hear the endogenous signaling, the internal stuff, because it needed that many receptors to work. And I think people sort of start to get that. But that's, I think, also asking a lot of our average consumer. And this is something where I think that it's a fine line and it's difficult to tread. But we want to give people the information that they need to make reasonable and informed decisions. But at the same time, people have varying interests in delving into that information and perhaps, and I don't want to sound like a jerk about it, but perhaps varying abilities to delve into it themselves. And so again, sort of circling back to at least my own experience, I think this is where clinicians really need to come into this story, because we are not, and really never have been, in the position of telling people what to do or making decisions for them. Our job is to guide people, to help interpret all of that morass of 35,000 studies down into some sort of recommendations and justify it to people so that they understand why we're making those recommendations. But at the same time, to simply throw at them, go to PubMed and figure it out, or go down to the dispensary and figure it out. I mean, that's just asking, it's unrealistic, right? And people will kind of throw their hands up in the air and they'll go ask the bud tender, because who else can they ask if they can't ask somebody like me? So I think that there's a very interesting dynamic between putting information, particularly for public health, out there in ways that people can digest and also will pay attention to. And I don't think we've done it very well in any arena, to be honest. I mean, people still smoke cigarettes, far fewer than they used to, but and that's probably our best success. So I worry a lot, and particularly with the commercial aspect of legalization of one sort or another, that getting that message that you're talking about putting before people is somewhat, I don't want to say it's doomed to failure, but it is definitely an uphill battle, because, as you mentioned, funding it isn't very sexy, and people would rather buy an extra ounce of weed than pay to go see the doctor and get some advice, and that sort of thing, I think, complicates our ability to roll this out in the safest and most effective way possible.
I just have one last question for the both of you. How do you foresee the development of medical cannabis policy impacting the broader economy, including the pharmaceutical industry?
You want to take that one first?
Sure. How do I see it affecting the broader economy? Well, it's very clear that a lot of the impetus for legalization of various sorts is driven by economic factors, right? Even in the medical arena, where in at least most states, most jurisdictions don't tax medical patients' medicine. Some do, and that's a bad thing, but most of them don't. But there's all sorts of economic benefit to the state in terms of regulatory fees, right? Plus employment, right? I mean, that it's a huge source of new jobs, and everybody wants to be able to crow about how they're making new jobs. So I think that sort of thing is definitely a positive. And And then obviously on the recreational side, then there's somewhere between, 15 and 40% additional tax, depending upon whether you're in California or in Massachusetts. And so I think that's huge. But I think that ultimately the big economic benefit from my perspective really revolves around medical. I think that, right now what we're seeing is a lot of enthusiasm around being able to sell to general consumers, but that in a general sense, we've seen that people are moving from the illicit market into the regulated market, and that's good. But I don't think we're generating a whole lot of new customers in that recreational arena. And that recreational number in the United States has been relatively fixed at somewhere between 20 and 30 million Americans, which sounds like a big number until you start to think that in the aging population, we're looking at more like 180 to 200 million Americans. But most of those people aren't getting access to cannabis, again, because it's not on their radar and it's not on the radar of their physicians. So I think that in the end, the biggest economic benefit has yet to come. And also the best medical value is yet to come. But that's going to require all the things that we've been talking about in terms of streamlining and focusing the medical side of the industry, educating clinicians better. And ultimately, while cannabis as a plant is a good medicine and is also a good teacher, I do believe that we will eventually, through various regulatory changes, start to see the pharmaceutical industry get involved. And then we'll be in a position where hopefully we have medications that are more specific and more effective, or at least better researched, and that are available through pharmacies with a prescription, so that my colleagues are that much more able to practice medicine in a way that fits with their understanding. As a matter of policy, and then I'll shut up, but as a matter of policy, what we at ACS fear and want to intervene upon is this idea that if we want ultimately, or there will be ultimately, pharmaceuticals that are developed, the question is, does medical as sort of this middle lane disappear before then, in which case we've got nothing for our patients. And so our theory has been that we want to encourage greater research and development of more specific products, but we want to do it in a way that maintains a medical system, at least for the interim between today and when we have these better, more specific and more research medications available. And that's a policy that really needs to be installed at the federal level, and we're advocating for that.
So yeah, there's a whole lot there that you said that I think warrants further discussion. I think that there are populations that right now are sort of underutilized in their use of cannabis that in the future are going to use cannabis more often, particularly as a medicine. And I'm in particular thinking about I say seniors, but now at 52, I keep pushing back what a senior constitutes. But I'm thinking that, age 55 and older, that is a generation that is, that is aging, that is going to have aches and pains, that by and large has some firsthand experience with cannabis. It may have been quite some time ago, but cannabis isn't a total mystery to them. And I think they're a population that can potentially gain quite a bit of benefits from the right particular tailored cannabis product in their lives. In particular, I'm thinking about the substitution effect, the idea that cannabis can replace potentially certain pharmaceuticals that might not have superior safety profiles to cannabis, or at a minimum may perhaps allow someone to reduce the dose that they're currently taking some of these pharmaceuticals. I think a lot of older Americans are seeking that. They're aware of contraindications between various drugs, and they would like to reduce the overall totality of pharmaceuticals they're taking every day. And cannabis, I think, for some of them, offers that opportunity. So I do think there's a population there that is going to become more and more familiar and more experienced with cannabis. I think there are regulatory changes that may be on the horizon that also will help stimulate some of that transition. Um, you know, when and if, say, medical cannabis products become products that a patient can find their insurance company will reimburse them for, I think you would then see a much greater utilization of those products. If a person can file for workers' comp if they're hurt on the job and use cannabis to recover from that injury, and then will be reimbursed for those expenses. Again, I think you would see more people than going down that path than maybe going now, when the choice would be between, well, I can use this pharmaceutical product and my insurance company is going to pay for it, and I have a copay of $24 versus buying cannabis that might cost me $150, and then next week I have to go back and get it again. So I think as there become more regulatory changes at the state and federal level, eventually there's going to be changes that, again, are going to lead more patients in this direction. I'm somewhat less convinced going forward that there's going to be an advent of a number of pharmaceutical or traditional pharmaceutical based products based upon cannabis. And I simply say that because of knowing how much upfront cost is involved in bringing such a product to market. And we know these companies are looking for a return on their investment. And I question whether a traditional pharmaceutical company, your Eli Lilly, your Pfizer's, your Merck's, would take on the upfront expense that could run into hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, to gain traditional FDA market approval for a cannabis-based pharmaceutical drug, when at the end of the day, they know going in that that their drug is going to have to be competing against plant cannabis, which is already legal in so many of these jurisdictions. I think in order for them to do so, they would have to be convinced they're going to have a much more superior product. And perhaps that's possible, but again, I'm not convinced. And because I think some of these companies do care about their bottom line, they're somewhat risk averse when it comes to spending large amounts of money. I'm sure I don't have to tell you, Jordan, that a lot of research and drug development is done by smaller companies, and when they're successful, those larger companies then simply come in and acquire them. So, again, given the prevalence of cannabis already, given its wide stream availability, I think even in an environment where cannabis is more readily accessible than today, because of further changes in federal and state law, I think that might discourage some of these traditional companies from entering the market in the traditional sense.
I certainly think that, and we've heard this from some of the drug companies, that if botanical cannabis is reimbursable by insurance, that would be a significant deterrent for them to do that R&D. I don't think that botanical cannabis is likely to become insurance covered anytime soon, largely because that process usually follows CMS, which follows FDA. I mean, there's a process here, which, one can see how you can easily argue that that's a negative, but at the same time, you could also take the longer view, which is that is in fact deliberate to encourage the kind of research that we actually hope will get done. But I see your point about the costs, and I agree that the best case scenario here is that small companies start to do that research. And when there's signal that they found a superior product, then they get snapped up by the big guys who can take it through the phase 2 and 3 trials and market. You know, there's a lot about drug development in this country that is not done the way, it's done the way it seems to be able to be done under the circumstances, but it's not necessarily the most linear or successful. You know, if you look at the fact that pain is the #1 complaint in America, and yet all the new drugs we see are novel oncologic drugs. Now, don't get me wrong, we need novel oncologic drugs, but the point is that very few companies are trying to go after such a broad indication as pain, even though you can see that the market for it is enormous. It's because you have to have a real blockbuster in order to kind of get above the noise floor. I'm hopeful that that can happen from cannabinoids. I don't know that it's cannabis per se. I see cannabis, the plant, as sort of more like the teacher, and that hopefully we learn some lessons from the cannabinoids that are there, and also perhaps from cannabinoids that then we sort of design or implement based on what we've learned. I think that the future there is wide open, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the traditional pathway that most drugs follow. And again, I'm hopeful as well that we are going to continue to keep learning about the plant, its mechanism of action, how it interacts with humans, and that the more we learn, ideally, the more the narrative surrounding cannabis and ultimately the policy surrounding cannabis will evolve in accordance. You know, this has never been, to me, a question of we don't know enough about cannabis. The issue has always been, why do we not have policies that incorporate what we do know? And that, I think, has been very difficult, or has certainly taken quite some time to implement in this country. But I do think, you know, that is changing now. And again, I do think that if we change the way we talk about cannabis, invariably we then change the way we think about cannabis, and ultimately we change the way we legislate cannabis. And all of those things need to happen.
Amen. Awesome. Thank you.
Well, with that, we will wrap it up for our discussion today. Paul Armentano, Dr. Jordan Tishler, it was fascinating to hear you speak on these subjects that you're so passionate about. Thank you so much for joining me today and all of our viewers. And thank you to the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists as well as NORML for bringing us together.
At the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, we are on a mission to train healthcare providers using research-backed science and to advocate for delivery systems that better serve patient care. Our children need us, and our parents do too. Help ACS bring care and relief to all who need it. Donate to ACS today.